We are taught that the Suez Canal was one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. We are told it was built by French vision and Egyptian labor to connect the Mediterranean and Red Seas. But this is the sanitized version of history. It ignores the most important question: who paid for it? And more crucially, who profited from it? If you want to understand how the British Empire conquered Egypt without invading it, how a construction project became a financial weapon, and how debt can be more powerful than cannons, you have to look past the engineering marvel. You have to look at the ledger books. The Suez Canal wasn't conquered by armies. It was foreclosed by bankers. This is the story of how Egypt built the pathway to their own economic colonization, one shovel of sand at a time. The pharaoh's gamble. To understand this financial tragedy, we must travel to Cairo in 1854, to the court of Khedive Ismail. Pasha Ismail was a man caught between two worlds. He ruled an ancient land, but his Egypt was economically backward. He had visited London and Paris and witnessed the power that modern technology could give to a nation. He returned to Egypt determined to transform his medieval province into a modern European state. The opportunity came in the form of Ferdinand de Lesseps, a French diplomat turned entrepreneur, obsessed with cutting a canal through the Isthmus of Suez. The idea was economically brilliant. The route around the Cape of Good Hope was 11,000 miles and took months. A canal through Suez would cut the distance to 6,000 miles. Every merchant in Europe and Asia would pay premium prices to use such a shortcut. But there was a problem. The British government hated the idea. Britain controlled the Cape route through naval stations. A Suez Canal would bypass British maritime power and allow other nations to reach India directly. The British Foreign Office did everything possible to block the project. This is where Khedive Ismail saw his opportunity. If he could build the canal himself, Egypt would control the most valuable trade route in the world. It would be Egypt's path to independence. In 1854, Ismail granted de Lesseps a concession to build and operate the Suez Canal. The terms seemed favorable to Egypt. Egypt would own 44% of this. The company would have the right to collect tolls for 99 years, after which the canal would revert to Egypt. Ismail believed he was making a deal that would make Egypt wealthy. He had no idea he was signing his country's economic death warrant. The construction nightmare. When construction began in 1859, the true costs quickly became apparent. The canal required massive earthworks, locks, harbors, and support infrastructure. The original estimate of 200 million francs proved laughably inadequate. By 1863, the company needed 300 million francs. By 1866, it needed 400 million. The costs kept rising as engineers encountered unexpected geological challenges. Meanwhile, Egypt was required to provide more than just land. The concession obligated the Egyptian government to supply free labor for the project. Tens of thousands of Egyptian peasants were conscripted to work on the canal in conditions that resembled slavery. They were paid minimal wages, housed in squalid camps, and worked in the brutal heat of the desert. But the human cost was only part of Egypt's burden. When the company ran short of funds, Egypt was pressured to buy additional shares or provide direct subsidies. Ismail borrowed money from European banks to meet these obligations, using Egypt's future cotton revenues as collateral. The cotton revenues were crucial to understanding Egypt's vulnerability. The American Civil War had disrupted global cotton supplies, creating a boom in Egyptian cotton exports. For a few years in the 1860s, Egypt was flush with cash from cotton sales to European textile mills. Ismail used this temporary windfall to borrow heavily against future cotton revenues, assuming the boom would continue indefinitely. It was a fatal miscalculation. When the American Civil War ended in 1865, American cotton returned to global markets. Egyptian cotton prices collapsed. Suddenly, Egypt was committed to massive debt payments based on revenues that no longer existed. The country was caught in a classic debt trap, borrowing money to service existing debts while their ability to generate revenue was declining. By 1869, when the Suez Canal finally opened with great fanfare, Egypt had spent over £100 million on the project. This was equivalent to several years of Egypt's total government revenue. The country was technically bankrupt, but most of the canal revenues were going to European shareholders, not to the Egyptian government. The debt spiral accelerates. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 should have been Egypt's moment of triumph. The engineering achievement was remarkable, and the canal immediately became one of the world's busiest waterways. Ships from Europe could now reach India in 3 weeks instead of 3 months. The tolls generated millions of pounds annually, but instead of solving Egypt's financial problems, the canal's success made them worse. The problem was that Egypt owned only 44% of the canal shares, but it paid far more than 44% of the construction costs. The European shareholders had invested primarily in shares, not in loans to the Egyptian government. When the canal became profitable, They received dividends proportional to their shareholding. Egypt received dividends on its shares, but also had to service enormous construction debts that the company itself did not owe. Think about the perverse incentives this created. The canal company had every reason to maximize toll revenues, because the profits went to shareholders. But Egypt, which had paid for much of the construction, was stuck with fixed debt payments regardless of how much the canal earned. The more successful the canal became, the greater the disparity between European profits and Egyptian debt service. Khedive Ismail tried to solve this problem by borrowing more money for additional modernization projects. He built railways, telegraphs, harbors, and palaces. He hired European architects to redesign Cairo and Alexandria. He created a modern army with European weapons. Every project was financed with European loans. The European banks were happy to lend because Egypt seemed to have unlimited potential. The canal tolls provided steady revenue. Cotton exports still generated substantial foreign currency. From the perspective of London and Paris, lending to Egypt was a safe investment. But the bankers were making the same mistake that borrowers always make in a bubble. They assumed current conditions would continue indefinitely. They were lending based on best-case scenarios. By 1875, Egypt had owed £100 million to European creditors. The annual debt service consumed over 60% of government revenues. Ismail was borrowing money just to pay the interest on previous loans. The Egyptian government was technically insolvent, but no one wanted to admit the truth. The crisis came suddenly. In 1875, global financial markets experienced a severe contraction. Egypt found itself unable to roll over its short-term debts. The government faced an immediate cash crisis with no obvious solution. It was at this moment of maximum vulnerability that the British government made its move, the 24-hour takeover. The events of November 1875 demonstrated how financial warfare could achieve what military conquest could not. Khedive Ismail, facing an immediate cash crisis, made a decision that would haunt Egypt for the next century. He decided to sell Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal Company. The Egyptian government owned 177,000 shares in the canal company, representing 44% of the total. These shares were Egypt's most valuable asset, generating substantial annual dividends. But they were also the only liquid asset the government could sell quickly to raise cash. Ismail needed £4 million immediately to avoid defaulting on government bonds due in December. The sale was conducted in absolute secrecy, because Ismail knew that if the news leaked prematurely, the share price would collapse. He approached European banking houses discreetly, looking for a buyer who could provide immediate cash for the entire block of shares. Most banks were reluctant to commit to such a large purchase on short notice. The British government learned of the potential sale through their extensive intelligence network in Egypt. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli realized immediately that this was an opportunity to achieve British strategic objectives without military action. If Britain could acquire Egypt's canal shares, they would become the largest single shareholder in the canal company and gain effective control over the world's most important trade route. But there was a problem. The British Treasury didn't have £4 million readily available for such a speculative purchase. Parliament was not in session and couldn't authorize the expenditure. Any delay would give other potential buyers time to make competing offers. Disraeli needed to act within hours, not weeks. The solution came from an unlikely source. Lionel de Rothschild, head of the London branch of the Rothschild banking dynasty. When Disraeli approached him for an immediate loan of £4 million, Rothschild supposedly asked only one question: when do you need it? When Disraeli replied, tomorrow, Rothschild simply said, you shall have it. The transaction was completed with stunning speed. On November 25, 1875, the British government purchased Egypt's entire holding of Suez Canal shares for £4 million. The money was provided by Rothschild as a bridge loan, to be repaid when Parliament voted the necessary funds. Within 24 hours, Britain had become the controlling shareholder in the Suez Canal Company without firing a shot or negotiating a treaty. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to everyone except the Egyptians. Britain now controlled the canal that connected their empire to India and the Far East. They could guarantee safe passage for British ships, while potentially restricting access for competitors. The canal that Egypt had built to gain independence had instead become the instrument of their subjugation. But the financial implications were even more devastating than the strategic ones. Egypt had sold their most valuable asset to pay current debts, but the debts remained. The £4 million from the share sale barely covered Egypt's immediate obligations. The country still owed over £90 million to various creditors, but now had no canal dividends to help service those debts. It was like selling your house to pay your credit card bills while keeping the mortgage. The debt collectors arrive. By 1878, Egypt defaulted on its government bonds. The default triggered immediate intervention by European creditors who sent accountants instead of armies. The British and French governments established the Caisse de la Dette Publique, a commission of European officials who took direct control of Egyptian government finances. This body had the authority to collect taxes and ensure that debt service took priority over all other obligations. It was financial colonialism at its most sophisticated. The commission implemented devastating austerity measures. Government spending was slashed by 50%. Taxes were increased dramatically, while public services were eliminated. Egypt's productive assets, railways, telegraphs, ports, were placed under European management. Egypt had become a debt farm, existing primarily to generate cash flow for foreign creditors. In 1879, Ismail was forced to abdicate in favor of his more compliant son. The message was clear. Egypt's rulers served at the pleasure of Egypt's creditors. The revolutionary response. The financial colonization inevitably produced a nationalist reaction. Colonel Ahmad Jarabe began organizing resistance to the European financial occupation. His critique was fundamentally economic. The Egyptian people were being taxed into poverty to pay debts they had never approved. The British government watched with growing alarm. They had invested too heavily in Egyptian debt to allow a nationalist revolution to succeed. In 1882, when Jarabe's forces took control of Alexandria, the British used this as a pretext for military intervention. But the British intervention was not a conquest in the traditional sense. It was a debt collection operation with guns. The stated purpose was to restore the Caisse de la Dette Publique and ensure continued debt payments. Egypt became a de facto British protectorate through financial necessity. The modern echo of the story resonates powerfully today because similar dynamics are playing out across the developing world. Consider Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka. Built with Chinese loans, when Sri Lanka couldn't service the debt, they were forced to lease the port to China for 99 years. The parallel to Britain's acquisition of Suez Canal shares is striking. The lesson is that countries must be extremely careful about financing major projects. Debt that seems manageable during good times can become overwhelming when conditions change. The Suez Canal stands today as one of the world's most important trade routes, generating billions for Egypt. But it took Egypt nearly a century to fully control the asset they had built. The canal that was supposed to make them immediately wealthy instead made them a British protectorate. The British acquisition of Egypt's canal shares in 1875 was a masterclass in economic warfare. By understanding Egypt's financial vulnerabilities, the British achieved their strategic objectives without the costs of military conquest. They didn't need to invade Egypt because they already owned it. Sometimes the most expensive infrastructure is the infrastructure you can't afford to own. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. The next debt trap is already being constructed, and the nations that understand the lessons of the Suez Canal will be the ones that avoid becoming the next Egypt.